welcome to this month's episode of the Cyber Threat Briefing from the 𝗂𝗀𝗄 podcast. This month I'm joined, as usual, by Hugh and Arron.
Hello.
And again this month by Aaron Dalswell as well. So welcome, guys.
Hi there, everyone.
Hope you're both doing well.
Certainly are.
Good. So I've got a couple of topics of discussion this week. We've got three things to get through, essentially. So we're going to talk about OneNote currently being used, has been used for the past couple of months for delivery of malicious payloads during kind of, active campaigns against organizations. I'm going to kind of dig into that a little bit, talk about what we can decipher from it, some actionable takeaways from it as well. A few weeks ago, there was an article around flaws in TPM. So what does that mean? What's the attack vectors here? Should we be worried about it, crucially? And then we're going to have an open discussion at the end around trending the line between good and bad in cybersecurity. So there's an article that we'll cover off later on in some more detail around how ethical hackers, or a particular ethical hacker, has been found to be part of a ransomware group as well. So we're just going to a little open discussion into that and maybe what the future of the industry looks like from that perspective. So, shall we get into it? We'll start off with the OneNote attack vectors from attack perspective. So these kind of came out in the news. Have been known about since kind of mid-December time, and essentially, as the scene or the landscape for phishing attacks changes on a regular basis, attackers have to find new ways. And one of the new ways that they found to get through things, to get through the defenses, and kind of filtering and so on and so forth, is around using OneNote to deliver malicious payloads to users. That's kind of the news article right now that's gone off and has been landing in the last couple of days. So before we get into what that means, Aaron, would you be able to give us a brief history of phishing? So what did it used to look like? How easy was it? What's that now look like these days? Have things changed in that time frame?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess in this case, we'll focus on email phishing in particular. I think is a good focus point. And email phishing is about as old as email itself, certainly as old as the internet itself, being a widely connected set of devices. So it started generally with either chat rooms or email messages telling people to log in. This was back in the day when trust was pretty much inherent in the internet's operation, and people were more likely to click on things. Email was this new medium, and they were excited to receive emails and click on things. So the original phishing emails were fairly straightforward. It was just telling people to log in somewhere or attaching files and things like that. That's progressed over time as defenses have come into play, and it's become much more difficult to send large-scale email attacks. Those low-bar phishing attacks that we've talked about in previous episodes, sending out spam to millions of people, isn't as effective as it used to be. It's not as profitable as it was in that sort of boom in the early 2000s when chain mails and spam emails were rife and filtering hadn't quite caught up. We're now getting towards the point where attackers are having to be quite sophisticated and quite tactical in the way they evade the phishing defenses that exist in organizations. So whether that's your Exchange or Gmail filtering and the various controls you've got to limit attachments, to have SPF, sender protection frameworks in place to make sure you trust the other domain, so domain reputation comes into play. And in particular, this attack focuses on attachments and the difficulty now in getting an attachment that you can have a user click on and then have something malicious happen.
Okay, so it's the landscape's significantly changed over the years, becoming more and more difficult. And I guess that's because there's now built-in a lot of built-in protections into your more common mail providers, like you said, like Gmail, like Microsoft 365, so on and so forth. And they are, from experience, relatively difficult to get by, consistently enough. The defenses are changing quite regularly. So yeah, good history there. Thank you, Aaron. Hugh, there's an extra point here that's relevant, right? So what is it specific to things like Word and Excel based attacks previously? What's changed now there that means that we have to find new ways?
Yeah, so basically recently, Microsoft disabled macros from being able to be used in Word and Excel documents downloaded from the web, which is a huge blocker for these attacks. Macros being really useful for executing code on machines when those files are delivered, as Aaron said. Now, attackers are not just going to give up, right? Always looking for that path of least resistance, and so basically just moved on to the next available option, which, yeah, as Arron said, is in this case is embedding VB code into OneNote attachment into OneNote files sent as email attachments. And because that VB file isn't itself the email attachment, it's subject to a lot lower level of checking, and so these documents are coming through. Typically, we'll see things like the document is blurred out, but it pertains to be something really important, and then there'll be a button that says, click here to activate the secure document, and then underneath that button then is actually just a bunch of links to embedded VB files, which will then run that code on the machine. So it's a very similar way of working, very similar outcome, just a slightly different method of delivery. And I think it's probably an issue that Microsoft are going to be facing eternally, right? As soon as they lock some mechanism away, attackers are just going to come back and find another alternative.
It's the mechanism for getting things into an organization that's the thing that changes, as opposed to the actual intricacies of what we're doing there. So previously we would have, in a simplistic term, as Arron mentioned, back in the day, if you like, we would have sent an email with an Excel file attached to it, probably not had too many issues along the way. Someone opens that Excel file and runs the macro, and that's how we're looking to get the foothold on. Now all that's changed really is how we deliver that macro into an organization, essentially to be able to run that code. And like you said, now it's a case of it's embedded within OneNote files, which are typically a lot easier to get into organizations, and therefore when you do run something, it's got a lot more trust on it than it would have alternatively. Good. Okay, so it's the mechanism thing. The mechanism for getting things in is changing, but ultimately the fundamentals of how it operates is roughly the same. So good. So Arron, we'll come back to you now. How can this be remediated? So what should organisations be doing now to remediate this type of attack?
Yeah. So beyond all the usual phishing defences that you'd have in place that we've discussed at length in various previous podcasts, for this particular type of attack, I would focus on looking at the OneNote attachment files specifically. So there are two things you could do. You could consider just blocking the .1 extension at your email filter. I appreciate, though, that for most organizations, that's probably a step too far because there are legitimate use cases for sharing a OneNote file. So the alternate approach here, if you have a bit more of an acceptance to your risk appetite, would be to look at blocking specific extensions from being embedded within files. So there's a group policy you can set to disable, for example, .vbs, .exe, .com, and a few other file types that are typically used for malicious activities. Just disable those from being executed when they're embedded in files. So look into just changing the way that you interact with those OneNote files.
Okay, perfect. And I don't think I've ever had a need to send a whole .1 file to someone. Usually just use the share within OneNote type settings. So perhaps that isn't necessarily a bad shout. If you've got an immediate danger, perhaps that's the first protocol. Block it and then figure out from there what to do. Excellent. Okay, guys. I think that wraps that particular topic point up, unless there's anyone else that has anything to add. We'll move on to the next one in the list, which is around TPM. So TPM 2.0 flaws, which could be used to allow attackers or hackers to steal cryptographic information, ultimately. Feels like a decently sized topic, this one, and there's probably a few terms in here that the listeners may or may not be aware of. So we'll start from the top, and then we'll work in from there. So Arron, we'll come to you first and foremost. Could you explain what TPM is in the first instance, how that works, and then we'll get into the attack itself?
Yeah, sure. So TPM is a fairly complex software. TPM, initially, it stands for Trusted Platform Module. And what this is it's normally in most devices, it's a piece of hardware that's performing cryptographic functions. However, there are also software-based TPMs that do the same thing but are emulated in software. But fundamentally, they are meant to be a hardware cryptographic platform that performs functions such as key generation, random number generation, as well as providing secure storage for those associated keys. And this is really useful because it allows you to do things like authentication using Windows Hello and biometrics and storing those locally. It allows you to store trusted keys that you can then use to authenticate to various services and provide integrity of things like the boot process for Windows to ensure that Windows loads securely and doesn't have malware attached to it. So it has a lot of great uses. BitLocker would be another one, in fact, for encryption of drives on Windows. BitLocker stores the key in the trusted platform module. So these are complex, small devices, basically, that have a lot of trust inherently built into them because of the nature of the security work they do in cryptography.
Okay, and then they sit outside the operating system, right? So they run, or can run as a chip on its own right.
Yeah, absolutely. One way to explain them would be to consider them a system on a chip. They're a miniature operating system in and of themselves.
Perfect. So who maintains and defines what a TPM chip does? Is it Microsoft? Is it an operating system? Is it like someone like Linux Foundation, something like that, or is it someone else?
Yeah, it's someone else. There's a group called the Trusted Computing Group, and they're responsible for writing the specification. I think 15 or so years ago now, they released the initial specification. And then at the moment, we're on TPM 2.0, which I think was released initially around 2016, came into the public space a bit more around 2019. And it's a pretty long specification, actually. It's split into various parts, thousands and thousands of pages long. And then vendors that want to implement this have to adhere to the specification. And as with anything, when you've got a long specification, the interpretation of that could lead to flaws or implementation variations that could have an impact.
Okay, perfect. So TPM has been around a little while. We're on 2.0. What's the future of TPM? Is it here to stay? Is it going to be part of our lives more often moving forwards?
Yeah, very much so. So where we are today is that Windows 11, for example, Microsoft's latest operating system, mandates that you have a TPM for you to be able to use the operating system. And that's specifically for the purposes of providing additional integrity and protections on Windows itself to prevent things like what used to be called rootkits, those sorts of Trojans that would embed themselves in the boot sectors of the drive and do things to modify the operating system before it even loads. So they're really difficult pieces of malware to delete from the system. And the TPM helps mitigate that by doing that integrity checking. So Microsoft mandates it. It's supported on other operating systems. Various Linux implementations of the libraries are supported as well. So we're only going to see an increase, I think, in the use of trusted platform modules, or at the very least, interpretations of a trusted platform module that are dedicated to forming cryptographic security functions within our lives.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty important step that Microsoft have decided Windows 11 is requiring one to be installed, in all honesty. I know there's the Apple have the, I think they call it secure enclave, or however you want to pronounce it. But I think that's exactly the same principle, right? So it's an area of system in and of itself that can handle things like your biometrics and your all your kind of Apple Wallet-y bits and pieces. So okay, so the future looks good from this. It's going to be here for a while and here to stay. Big question then, Hugh, is it secure? And we know it's not secure, hence we're talking about it, and there are a couple of vulnerabilities there. So do you want to dive into what those vulnerabilities are and what's been found?
Yeah, certainly. So I guess on the is it secure? That is, it's more of an interesting question than it first appears, right? So there's a few things we have to look at. First off, is it's typically a hardware piece, right? So do you trust the manufacturer? If you don't trust the manufacturer of that TPM to not have your unique seed stored, which is what is all future generation and things are based on that unique seed. If you don't trust that manufacturer, then no, it's not secure. You have no assurance that this device is going to be working in the way that you require it to. Luckily, most manufacturers are following this spec, and they're big brands, so we're assuming that's good. We then need to look at the fact that, as Arron touched on earlier, right, these are very small bits of kit, very small chips, and because of the function that they're performing, they have to operate entirely separately and independently of that operating system. There can be no reliance on the OS's compute or storage, because that in itself would be an avenue of attack. And cryptography is incredibly computationally expensive, right? So you've got tiny bits of kit doing difficult work. So it's not as easy as developing software firmware for typical IT usage. So we see quite a lot of bugs in TPM implementations. It's not uncommon. What is uncommon about this one is that it's it is a proof of concept vulnerability rather than just a bug that affects functionality. There is, a potential avenue of exploitation here. The specifics of this one are around a function that you can call. So with a TPM, you basically send it a command and it returns your response. With this one, there's a command that you can send this TPM, and with the parameters that you give it, it's possible to access data. It's called a buffer overflow. Access data outside of the bounds of that, and that can be both reading data outside of the bounds of the memory that you're supposed to access, and also writing data as well. Now, this is only 2 bytes, right? So that's a very small amount of data. Two ASCII characters as we typically see them. So a tiny amount of data, and you'd have to rely on the fact that valuable sensitive data was in that memory segment next to the memory you're supposed to access, or that you could write something useful there. The chances of this just corrupting the implementation entirely and just returning junk is really high. But the interesting point here is that it feasibly is possible, although we've not yet seen any sort of active exploitation of this.
Okay, so we're very much in the proof of concept, but it is possible phase. And buffer overflows feels like we're back in mid 2000s. Suddenly here, so back to old school stuff.
Absolutely right, and it's the fact that these, like I said, them being so small and restricted, we can't have a lot of the typical modern buffer overflow mitigations like address-based randomization and things like that, because these are really small, which is why we're seeing attacks from years ago resurfacing again.
Yeah, exactly. What was old school is new school again, by the looks of it. So, all fun times. Fantastic. It feels, before we get into the way we can mitigate this, the recommendations, it does feel, you mentioned there your first point, Hugh, around do you trust the supplier of that chip? Feels like there could be a supply chain issue in years down the line, potentially, if someone can compromise the supply chain for the organisation that's creating the vast majority of these chips, or some of them, and that feels like it could be an avenue of attack way down the line, ultimately. So, yeah, one potential thing to consider, I guess, from the industry perspective. Well, let's talk about recommendations. So, Hugh, can you talk me through what the recommendations are here for organisations that are listening today? What can they do about this threat? Is it something they should be worried about in the immediate term?
So I'd like to think that from the explanation from a moment ago, it's not a hugely critical thing right now, and certainly there are patches available now that you can fix this issue with. I'd be surprised if many organizations had TPM on their asset register as a thing to consider patching. So it wouldn't be surprised me if that sort of thing was widely missed. It just goes to show the importance of really considering what these individual assets are. Right, it is, as Arron said earlier, basically a separate OS on a chip within your machine. So yeah, certainly it basically is a separate device. But yeah, you can pull these patches down from the OEM vendors and OS vendors and things like that. Might require a factory reset of the TPM to actually deploy that, but certainly it's possible, and it's something we should be doing.
Perfect. How about the physical access to devices? Is that something we should be wary of, I guess?
Yes, so obviously, this requires that physical access, right? As we said, it's that the TPMs are designed to be very tamper resistant, right? You can't just hook a couple of probes up to them and completely nullify them. But good practice, right, around physical access restrictions, tamper resistant screws and things like that around really sensitive kit is certainly always good to consider.
Okay, perfect. So it is a relatively difficult attack by the sounds of it, which may or may not have great results if you do manage to exploit it, but nonetheless could be quite devastating if that was if that was possible to achieve. Okay, Arron, final question to you. You are 𝗂𝗀𝗿𝗀𝗀's vCISO. Is there a level of awareness that you need to provide to employees, whether or not if for other CISOs that might be listening, or other people in security leadership positions, Is this something you would give a brief into up to the staff and say, look, this is what's happening, can you be aware of it?
Yeah, so this is something I'd probably consider more along the lines of providing it to the IT team or security team or the network infrastructure team of your organization and say, look, TPMs are now a broadly used thing within our organization. And to Hugh's point, we should consider adding it to our information assets register. Let's treat them a bit like if you're an organization, for example, that uses HSMs, hardware security modules, which are entire physical machines dedicated to performing cryptographic functions on a larger scale. Let's bring TPMs in line with those in the way we handle the security and handle update processes and monitoring where we can. However, it's not something that I would necessarily broadcast out to the entire organization because it's a deeply and inherently technical topic. Trusted platform modules, cryptography, they're complex topics. It goes over most people's heads, and actually the end user has very little control over what their TPM is doing. And by design, right? They're designed to operate on their own securely, without you as an end user even knowing that what's really happening or what's interacting with it. So I wouldn't necessarily send out a company-wide communication, but I'd start having the conversations with my security teams to talk about the use cases and the security bounds around how we treat our TPM and monitoring and patching of them.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Arron, and thank you, Hugh, for the input onto that one. We'll move on to the next topic. It's an interesting one. This is going to be an open discussion, so we'll have the remainder of the session chatting away through this one. Essentially, there has been a number of arrests for a ransomware gang, and it turns out that one of the guys in that gang is an ethical hacker. And I guess that throws up the question around treading the line between good and bad in cybersecurity. There's a fine line here, right? So we are doing authorized, I suppose, legal, illegal activities, right? So if we didn't have the permission to do what we're doing, it would be considered to be illegal in the vast majority of jurisdictions around the world. Now, clearly the skills are transferable. So if you want to turn bad, you could turn bad. And I guess the question or the discussion point here is, how does that get prevented? So how do we, as an industry, and this is probably more of an industry level discussion, how does that happen? How do we make sure that these kind of transitions from good to bad don't work out? But conversely, how do we encourage people to do bad to good? Right. So I'm aware there's a number of individuals around the industry have been for a number of years that may have been the wrong side and then now good side, gone legitimate, if you like. So let's have a chat about that and talk about what things can we do as an industry, what kind of measures can we put in place, and so on and so forth. I'll throw it over to the floor, guys. So Hugh or Arron, whoever wants to go first, and we'll have an open discussion on this one, if that's okay.
Right, yeah, so I think there's two sides to this. There's what can employers do, which is a bit more specific to an organization, but also as an industry. So if we start with the industry, what can the industry do? Well, there are various things already in place. The first and most obvious one is legislation and laws that prevent people from doing bad things. I know for me personally, I'm very scared of the Computer Misuse Act here in the UK. That would, if I had an inclination to do things maliciously, it would always be in the back of my mind that I could be prosecuted. Thankfully, it's never been of interest to me to do things outside the bounds of law, but I know that if I did do something bad and I was caught, there would be severe consequences for that. They're also a bit more closer to the bounds of me as a professional within cybersecurity. There are various codes of conduct. So, for example, in the UK, if you take any of the CREST examinations to become, for example, a CREST registered penetration tester, then you have to sign their code of conduct, which also discusses around how you should act ethically within your job. And you could lose your accreditation if you act unethically. So if you are found to have done something maliciously, beyond all the legal ramifications and potential jail time, you also have the loss of your certifications and your credibility within the industry. So there are things that are out there to kind of keep people on the straight and narrow, as it were. Another one that perhaps is a byproduct of all of this is actually a lot of organizations now have bug bounty programs and responsible disclosure programs that make it fine for you to do some probing as long as you then act ethically off the back of it to responsibly disclose to it, and perhaps even receive a reward if it's a major vendor and they have a specific care or need to care about security, and they might reward you via a bug bounty program. So there are plenty of avenues to direct people in the right direction as an industry to prevent them doing this for malicious purposes.
Okay, excellent. And it's worth mentioning, you talked about the Computer Misuse Act. I know there's a campaign, CyberUp campaign, that is working to try and get it reformed into something a bit more useful for the modern era. I think it was written I know it's had some amendments over the years. I think probably the last amendment was probably, I'm going to test my own knowledge, probably about at least 10, 15 years ago, something like that. So it's quite old, and the principles of it not necessarily match with how the internet and how devices on the internet are used today. So yeah, honourable mention for the Cyber Up campaign. I know they're working hard with trying to drive that through government, but maybe there is an element of governmental legislation needed here, Hugh. Perhaps we can talk about how other industries might operate from a licensing perspective. For example, if you were working in the law, you have to go through the bar and become signed in. I don't know the exact terminology, but I know there's professional bodies that maintain a council of professionals, things like doctors, for example. Are we as an industry at that point? Is that the direction we should be going down now?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one, right? Because there's so many different avenues of directions that you can take a career in cybersecurity, and I'm not sure that a sort of one size fits all accreditation would necessarily be the right approach. I know that the NCSC, along with CREST and the Cyber Scheme, are currently looking at putting together a chartered penetration tester scheme or something along those lines, which would I guess bring us in line with the medical legal professions and things like that. I think because of the nature of this industry, how people get into it. You don't become a doctor by spending time doing surgery at home and then deciding to qualify. Whereas things like Hack the Box, Try Hack Me, bug bounties that we were talking about are really sort of prevalent ways of people first getting into the industry. So I think saying to someone, you can't touch anything until you've got this baseline accreditation, potentially isn't the best approach, because I think most of us end up getting into this by sort of playing around with it first, through legal means before taking it up as a career, which obviously isn't analogous to those other professions.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a mindset, I think, a lot of time over knowledge. So asking the question of how does this work? What happens if I pull this? What happens if I pull that? They're the kind of things that dictate whether you're going to be technically good in this industry, I think. There's a lot of creativity in that, and I think one of the things if you went down the professionalization route or more professionalization route of mandated licenses to be a ethical hacker, or whatever it might be, is how do you maintain that creativity whilst keeping that professionalism going? Because I think that's it feels like a lot of the good innovation in the industry comes around when you're right on the edge of what's potentially okay, what potentially we may be doing research nowadays as an industry that 10 years ago probably we're kind of near enough to the edge now, whereas it's getting a bit more to the point of people understanding more a little bit what's going off. In 10, 15 years ago, that might not have been the case. It was just a bit more maverick in that respect. But a lot of good stuff happened back then. A lot of good innovations that happened 10, 15 years ago, what shaped the industry to what it is now. And that level of creativity back then, had that not been there, it'd have been too rigid, I guess is what we're looking at here. It becomes a bit more rigid, a bit more structured. Would we have been in the position that we're in now, with all the tooling that we've got and all the good things that came out of that shaped the way that we operate now?
I think ultimately it comes down to, is it going to be worth it, right? Risk and reward. I think, especially in, the US and the UK, ethical hacking is well paid. Bug bounties are well rewarding schemes. I can't see, we even look at this case here, right? The guy that was caught, 2 million of profit from ransomware, but he got caught, so none of that benefit gets realized. Typically, I think the majority of cyber criminals that we see, they've certainly got those skills, and it's just a much easier, probably more financially viable long term to just get a job and be white hat. Like there's just not really much incentive to break the law, because there's really no need, and there's a whole lot of risk involved.
There is. Look, I've been around. It'll be almost 11 years since I started this industry, but I don't have 2 million quid in the bank either. So I think criminality clearly pays quite well in this case, but you do run a high.
He doesn't have 2 million in the bank anymore, and he's got the rest of his life in prison. So,
well, yeah, I do have the opportunity to put 2 million quid in the bank, I suppose, at some point. There's a slight difference, I guess, in that case. But look, I think criminality pays too much. Probably, I think it's well worth people's time to get into that at this current time. But there is a humongous risk to getting caught, and rightly so, getting caught and getting reprimanded for that. I guess there's multifacets here, which is the less legitimate side of things, the criminality side of things, needs to be much less lucrative. And I think as an industry we do pretty well. Like you mentioned there, it's a relatively well-paid industry. I guess my wife always called this living in a bit of a cloud over here, outside of like normal industries and things like that. So I think it's paying particularly well, but it's the criminality side of it is obviously highly lucrative if you don't get caught. Basically a big if, right? So okay, good. Arron, final question to you. Again, come back to you as a 𝗂𝗀𝗿𝗃𝗀𝗀 VC. So how does this, obviously this guy, think about the news article, he I don't think there's a name against yet. They were working for they were an ethical hacker, part of the 𝗂𝗏𝗃 in the Netherlands, and it's clearly gone rogue. They clearly would have had access to quite a lot of information. So from a CISO's perspective, how can you mitigate against this? And I appreciate that's a difficult question, but is there things you can do, particularly maybe around principle of least privilege and so on and so forth?
Yeah, there are absolutely things that can be done. And just for clarity, so the 𝗂𝗏𝗃, which I think is the Dutch Institute for Vulnerability Disclosure, is what it stands for. It's a volunteer organization primarily. So it's not like employees are signing contracts and it's adherent to various policies internally necessarily. But the 𝗂𝗏𝗃 do have a code of conduct for their volunteer researchers that are conducting research on behalf of essentially a Dutch government-funded organization where there is some structure and then there are volunteers that go searching for vulnerabilities that they then have to responsibly disclose as part of that. And of course, if you've got a team of people who are going out there researching for vulnerabilities on the internet, scanning various IP address ranges, there is going to be some sort of knowledge sharing going on within that organization. Now, an anonymous source did say that in this case, the 𝗂𝗏𝗃 do have kind of isolation of particular research projects to only the people involved within it. So there shouldn't be that sharing of knowledge. And their internal investigation apparently did say that there was no evidence of abuse of any of the access that this particular malicious researcher had. However, that only goes as far as we trust the 𝗂𝗏𝗃. But for organizations more generally, what would I recommend? Well, it comes down to two things, really. Initially, make sure you do your due diligence when hiring people. So the vetting, the making sure you understand their employment history, that's a given. But once someone is an employee, you've got the question of, even if they are employed for a security purpose, a cybersecurity purpose, there still needs to be this application of principle of least privilege. What does that professional need to do their job? And how do we make sure they can't abuse that power and do things outside of it? The typical and kind of broad way that this all fits into how we achieve it within an organization still goes back to that really old acronym of IAAA: identification, authentication, authorization, and then critically at the end of all of that, the accountability or auditing. So making sure you know who that user is, you know how and where they should be able to authenticate to, and you confirm their identity when they're logging into a service, but also make sure that everything that even a security professional within your organization is doing has some level of auditing and accountability associated with it. So logs being generated, they still need to get approvals where appropriate. They can't just log into any system they want because they're a security professional, because otherwise you've got no way to have that traceability to understand what they've done, why they've done it, when they've done it. So even though security personnel are often in a trusted position within the organization, you should still have that principle of least privilege, that separation of duties, and where possible, have someone else able to check their work, just to keep people on the straight and narrow, as it were, within the organization. Without being too overbearing is the key thing there as well, of course.
Yeah, okay. So all measures to the right level, ultimately. Yeah, good. Cool, guys. I think that probably wraps us up for this month's episode. Thank you as always for joining me, Hugh and Arron, and for always providing the insights and the actual content that goes into this. I'm just here to ask the questions. So again, thank you. we'll catch all the listeners in a month's time. So thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.